I need to tell you something that happened to me 8 days ago that's going to sound completely impossible, but I swear on everything I hold sacred that every word of this is true. I was sitting alone in a cemetery in Prague at midnight, sobbing over my grandmother's grave marker that I had finally found after 3 years of searching, when Jesus appeared beside me and answered the question that's been haunting me since I was 7 years old. What really happens when we die? What he showed me didn't just change my understanding of death, it completely shattered everything I thought I knew about life. But before I begin my story, let me know in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is. I just want to know I'm not alone in this, and if you feel moved by what you hear, consider subscribing. It helps give me the strength to speak my truth. Now let's get into my story. I'm recording this from my hotel room in Prague, Czech Republic, where we just finished filming some additional scenes for The Chosen. It's 3 a.m. and I should be exhausted, but I can't sleep because what Jesus revealed to me about death and what comes after has completely revolutionized how I see everything, every relationship, every moment, every breath I take. Let me back up and tell you how I ended up in that cemetery in the first place. My grandmother, my yaya, was the most important person in my childhood. She's the one who taught me about faith, who prayed with me every night, who made me feel like I was the most special kid in the world. She immigrated from Greece when she was just 16, worked multiple jobs to support her family, and somehow still found time to spoil her grandchildren with unconditional love. But when I was 7 years old, she was diagnosed with cancer. I remember sitting in that sterile hospital room watching this woman who had seemed invincible to me suddenly look so small and fragile in that bed. That's when I first asked the question that would haunt me for the next 30 years. Yeah, what happens when people die? She smiled at me with those eyes full of love and said, "My little Jonathan, when we die, we go home to Jesus, and it's the most beautiful place you could ever imagine." Then she squeezed my hand and said, "But don't you worry about that now. I'm going to fight this thing." She did fight. For 8 months, she battled that cancer with everything she had, but I could see her getting weaker, and I became obsessed with the question of death. I would lie awake at night wondering what going home to Jesus actually meant. Was it real? Was it just something adults said to make kids feel better? If heaven was so beautiful, why was everyone so sad about people going there? When she died, I was devastated. But what made it worse was that nobody could give me answers that satisfied the questions burning in my 7-year-old heart. The priest talked about eternal rest and being with God, but it all felt vague and distant. My parents tried to comfort me with stories about her watching over me from heaven, but I wanted details. I wanted to know what she was actually experiencing. As I grew up, the question never left me. I studied theology, read countless books about near-death experiences, talked to pastors and priests and spiritual directors, but nothing ever felt complete. Nothing ever gave me the concrete understanding my heart was craving. When I was cast as Jesus, I thought maybe playing him would give me some special insight into what comes after death. I studied every passage in the Gospels where Jesus talks about eternal life, about his Father's house with many rooms, about the thief on the cross, being with him in paradise that very day. But even portraying those scenes, even speaking those words as Jesus, I still felt like I was missing something fundamental. 3 years ago, I decided I needed to find my grandmother's grave. She had been buried in Prague, where she had some distant relatives, but our family had lost touch with that site after her death. I hired a genealogist, spent months researching cemetery records, made 2 previous trips to Prague that ended in disappointment. But this time, filming in Europe gave me another opportunity. I had 1 free day before we flew back to the States, and I was determined to finally find her resting place. I'd located what I thought was the right cemetery, a beautiful ancient place called Olszany Cemetery that dates back to the 15th century. I spent 6 hours walking through that cemetery with a local guide, searching through records, checking grave markers. We found several graves with similar names, but nothing that matched exactly. As the sun began to set, I was ready to give up. This would be my 3rd failed attempt, and I was starting to think maybe I was never meant to find her. That's when my guide suggested we check one final section, an older area where many Eastern European immigrants had been buried in the mid-20th century. We walked through rows and rows of weathered headstones, many with inscriptions in languages I couldn't read. And then I saw it, a simple granite marker with her name, her dates, and a small cross. After 3 years of searching, I had finally found my Yaya. I knelt down in front of that headstone and just lost it. All the grief I had carried for 30 years. All the questions I had never gotten answers to. All the longing to understand what had happened to the woman who had loved me so completely. It all came pouring out. I sat there in that cemetery as darkness fell, talking to her grave like she could hear me. I told her about the chosen, about how her faith had shaped my faith, about how I wished she could see what my life had become. I told her how much I missed her, how many times I had needed her wisdom over the years. But then the old question came back with a force that surprised me. Yeah, I said out loud, not caring if anyone could hear me. I still don't know what happened to you when you died. I still don't understand what going home to Jesus actually means. Are you really somewhere? Can you really see me? Is consciousness real after death, or is it just nothing? The cemetery was completely silent. Most of Prague was asleep. I was alone among thousands of graves, feeling more isolated and confused about death than I had ever felt in my life. That's when I did something I had never done before. Instead of asking pastors or theologians or reading more books, I decided to ask Jesus directly. Not as part of my preparation for a role, not as an intellectual exercise, but as someone who desperately needed to understand one of the most fundamental questions of human existence. Jesus, I said, looking up at the stars barely visible through Prague city lights. I've been carrying this question for 30 years. I've played you for 6 years, spoken your words about eternal life dozens of times, but I still don't really understand what happens when we die. I need to know. Not just for my grandmother, but for everyone I love who's going to die someday. For myself, when my time comes. I paused, feeling the weight of how presumptuous my request might be. I know you probably don't just appear to people and answer their theological questions. But if you're really there, if you really care about our deepest fears and longings, I need you to help me understand this. Because death is the one thing every human being has to face, and most of us are terrified because we don't know what's really waiting for us. The cemetery remained silent for several minutes. I was starting to feel foolish for expecting some kind of supernatural response when a voice behind me said, "Jonathan, turn around." I spun around, and there he was sitting on a nearby bench as casually as if he had been waiting for me. Jesus, not glowing, not floating, not surrounded by angels, just sitting there in simple clothes, looking at me with eyes full of understanding for someone who had finally asked the question he'd been carrying his whole life. "You want to know what happens when people die?" he said. And it wasn't a question. All I could do was nod, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might wake the dead around us. "Then I'll show you," he said, standing up and walking toward me. "But I have to warn you. What you're about to see is going to change everything you thought you knew about death, about life, about why you're here and what you're preparing for." He sat down on the ground next to my grandmother's grave, completely at ease in this place that most people find unsettling. "Are you ready to see what really happens when someone dies?" he asked. I nodded again, though I wasn't sure I was ready for anything. "Then take my hand," he said, extending his hand toward me, "because we're going to take a journey." The moment I touched his hand, everything changed. We were no longer in that Prague cemetery. We were somewhere else entirely, somewhere that defied every assumption I had ever made about death and what comes after. And what Jesus showed me in that place will shock you as much as it shocked me. "The first thing you need to understand," he said, as this new reality settled around us, "is that death is not what anyone thinks it is. Not religious people, not atheists, not even most Christians. What actually happens when someone dies is far more complex, far more beautiful, and far more purposeful than anything human beings have imagined. I looked around at where we were, and what I saw challenged everything I thought I knew about life, death, and what it means to be human. But before I show you your grandmother, Jesus said, you need to understand the bigger picture. You need to see what death actually is, what it's for, and why it's not the end of anything. It's the beginning of everything." That's when the real journey began. The place where Jesus had taken me was unlike anything I could have imagined. It wasn't clouds and harps, and it wasn't fire and brimstone. It was, how do I even describe this? It was like being inside pure possibility itself. Everything around us seemed to shimmer with potential, as if reality here was more real than the reality I had always known. Where are we? I asked, my voice sounding different in this space. We're in the space between, Jesus said simply, the place where every human soul passes through when they leave their physical body. What most people call death is actually a transition point, a doorway, and what they think of as the afterlife is really just the next phase of an eternal journey that began long before they were born. He gestured around us, and suddenly I could see what looked like streams of light moving in every direction, each one pulsing with unique colors and patterns. Each one of those lights is a human soul, he explained. Every person who has ever died passes through this place. But here's what will shock you. Death isn't a punishment for sin, and it's not even really an ending. Death is a graduation. I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. A graduation. Earth is a school, Jonathan, a training ground. Every human life is a curriculum designed to teach specific lessons about love, forgiveness, courage, sacrifice, faith. When someone dies, they're not being removed from life. They're graduating to the next level of existence. He pointed to one of the streams of light that was particularly brilliant. But here's the first shocking truth about death. Not everyone graduates to the same place, not because I'm judging them, but because they've prepared themselves for different levels of responsibility in the eternal kingdom. I thought about all the sermons I'd heard about heaven and hell, about salvation and damnation. So, you're saying there are levels of heaven? Jesus smiled. I'm saying heaven is far more vast and complex than anyone has imagined. Remember when I told my disciples that in my Father's house are many rooms? I wasn't speaking metaphorically. There are infinite realms of existence, infinite ways to serve, infinite opportunities for growth and learning and love. He began walking, and I followed him deeper into this space between worlds. The second shocking truth about death is that it's not a surprise to anyone's soul. Deep down, every person knows exactly when their time on earth is complete. They've learned what they came to learn, or they've reached the limit of what they can accomplish in that particular lifetime. But what about accidents, I asked. What about people who die young or tragically? Jesus stopped walking and turned to face me, his expression infinitely compassionate. This is going to be hard for you to understand, but there are no accidents in death. Every soul chooses on some level the circumstances of their departure from earth. Not consciously, but spiritually. They choose based on what will serve their highest growth and the highest good of everyone their death touches. The implications of this were staggering. So when my grandmother died of cancer, she chose that death. Yes, not because she wanted to suffer, but because her suffering and her courage in facing death taught you and your family lessons about faith and love that you couldn't have learned any other way. I felt tears starting as I began to understand the profound purpose in what had seemed like senseless loss. The third shocking truth about death, Jesus continued, is that consciousness doesn't just continue after physical death. It expands. Most people think of death as a reduction, a losing of awareness, but it's actually an explosion of consciousness. When someone dies, they suddenly understand things they never could have grasped. While limited by a physical brain, he gestured toward another stream of light. That soul just realized the true purpose of every relationship they had on earth. They can see how every person they met, every conversation they had, every conflict they experienced was part of a larger design to help them grow in love. The fourth shocking truth is that death is immediate and gradual at the same time. The moment someone's heart stops beating, their soul is instantly here in this space between. But the process of fully understanding their earth experience and preparing for their next assignment can take what you would think of as years. I watched as some of the lights moved quickly through this space while others seemed to linger, pulsing with different rhythms. Why do some souls move faster than others, I asked. Because some people live their earth lives with greater awareness of their spiritual nature. They spent time in prayer, in meditation, in service to others. When they die, the transition feels natural because they were already living partially in the spiritual realm. Others are shocked to discover that consciousness continues, that they still exist. They need time to adjust. Jesus led me to what looked like a viewing area where we could observe what was happening in this space more closely. The fifth shocking truth about death is that reunion with loved ones is real, but it's not what people expect. When someone dies, they are indeed met by family members and friends who died before them. But these reunions aren't sentimental gatherings. They're purposeful meetings with their spiritual support team. I watched as one soul was surrounded by what appeared to be several other beings of light. What are they doing? Those are the souls who served as that person's spiritual family during their earth life. They're helping them review everything that happened, understand the lessons they learned, and prepare for whatever comes next. Some people call this a life review, but it's really a life celebration, a recognition of all the growth that occurred. The sixth shocking truth, Jesus said, his voice becoming more intense, is that hell, as most people understand it, doesn't exist, but separation from love does exist, and some souls choose it. I felt my theological understanding being completely restructured. What do you mean? Hell isn't a place I send people as punishment. Hell is a state of consciousness that souls create for themselves when they refuse to accept love, forgiveness, and growth. Even after death, every soul is given countless opportunities to choose love over fear, connection over isolation, growth over stagnation. But some souls, having spent their earth lives building walls around their hearts, continue to choose those walls even here. He showed me a section of this space that was darker, where some light seemed to be moving in circles rather than forward. Those souls are stuck in patterns of blame, resentment, self-hatred, or pride. They're not being punished. They're punishing themselves. And even they can choose differently at any moment. The seventh shocking truth about death is that everyone gets to see the full impact of their life, every person they influenced, every ripple effect of their actions, every way their existence mattered. This isn't judgment, it's revelation. They get to understand how their life served the greater good, even when they couldn't see it while they were alive. I thought about my grandmother again. So she knows how her death affected our family. She knows everything, Jonathan. She knows how her faith shaped your faith. She knows how her love for you prepared you to portray me with authenticity. She knows how her death taught your family to hold each other more tightly. She can see the ripple effects of her life extending through generations. The eighth shocking truth, Jesus continued, is that reincarnation, as some understand it, is real, but not in the way most people think. Souls don't just randomly get recycled into new bodies. Each life is a carefully designed curriculum. When a soul completes their learning in one realm, they may choose to return to Earth for advanced lessons, or they may move on to serve in other dimensions of reality. But not everyone reincarnates, no. Many souls graduate beyond the need for physical existence. They move into roles as guides, teachers, healers in the spiritual realms. Others choose to become what you might call guardian angels, helping souls still learning on Earth. The universe has infinite need for conscious beings willing to serve love. The ninth shocking truth about death is that time doesn't work the way you think it does. From this perspective, all of Earth's history is happening simultaneously. Past, present, and future are all accessible. When someone dies, they can observe and even influence events across all of time. The implications of this were mind-boggling, so the dead can affect the living, can affect. Absolutely, they can send love, inspiration, guidance, protection. They can't override free will, but they can create circumstances that make it easier for their loved ones to make good choices. What people call coincidences are often interventions from souls who have graduated beyond physical existence. The 10th shocking truth, Jesus said, his expression becoming more serious, is that every death serves the spiritual evolution of humanity as a whole. No one dies just for their own sake. Every death teaches something to the living about love, about loss, about what really matters, about the preciousness of each moment. I was overwhelmed by the scope of what he was revealing, so suffering and death have purpose. All suffering has purpose when it's understood correctly. Not the purpose of punishment, but the purpose of awakening. Suffering breaks open the human heart in ways that nothing else can. It strips away everything non-essential and reveals what's truly important. It forces people to ask deeper questions, to seek meaning beyond material existence. But the most shocking truth of all, Jesus said, his voice becoming soft and filled with infinite love, is that death is not required for any of this understanding. Everything I'm showing you about the nature of reality, about consciousness, about love and purpose and growth. All of this is available to people while they're still alive. Death is just one way to access this awareness, but it's not the only way. He turned to face me directly. That's why you're here, Jonathan. That's why I brought you to this place while you're still in your physical body. Because the people watching your life, the people who see you portray me, the people who are afraid of death and unsure about what comes after, they need to know that the love, the consciousness, the connection they're seeking is available right now. The space around us began to shift again, and I knew our journey was about to take us somewhere else. "Are you ready to see your grandmother?" he asked. My heart leaped. She's really here. She still exists. Jesus smiled the most beautiful smile I'd ever seen. "Jonathan, she never stopped existing, and she's been waiting 30 years to talk to you." Suddenly we were in what I can only describe as a garden that existed beyond all earthly understanding of beauty. Colors that don't exist on earth, painted landscapes that shifted and flowed like living art. The air itself seemed to sparkle with life and love, so concentrated you could almost taste it. And there, sitting on a bench beneath a tree whose leaves sang with gentle harmonies, was my Yaya. She looked exactly as I remembered her from my childhood. Vibrant, radiant, filled with that special kind of love that grandmothers have for their grandchildren. But there was something more now, something that hadn't been there when she was bound by her earthly body. She glowed with an inner light that spoke of deep peace, complete understanding, and joy beyond measure. "My little Jonathan," she said, standing up and opening her arms to me, "I've been watching you, and I am so proud of who you've become." I ran to her and embraced her, and in that moment, I felt more complete than I had felt since I was 7 years old. She felt real solid, present, not like a ghost or a memory, but like herself, fully alive and more herself than she had ever been on earth. Yeah, I've missed you so much," I said, through tears that felt like they were washing away 30 years of grief. "I've had so many questions, so many things I wanted to tell you." She held my face in her hands the way she used to when I was little. "I know, my darling. I've heard every prayer you've said, every time you've talked to my picture, every moment you've missed me. Death doesn't separate love, Jonathan. It only makes love stronger because it removes all the barriers that keep love from being perfect." Jesus stood nearby, smiling as he watched our reunion. "Tell him what you want him to know," he said gently to my grandmother. She took my hands and looked into my eyes with an intensity that somehow contained infinite gentleness. "The first thing I want you to understand is that dying was the most beautiful experience of my life. I know that sounds strange, but when my body finally let go, when I took my last breath on earth, it was like taking off shoes that had been too tight for too long." She gestured around the garden where we stood. "The moment I left my body, I was surrounded by so much love that I couldn't understand how I had ever felt alone or afraid. Your grandfather was there. You never met him, but he died before you were born. My parents were there, and my sister who died when we were children. But more than that, I could feel the love of everyone whose life I had ever touched, including you. You felt my love." I asked, "Oh, Jonathan, your love sustained me through my illness more than you'll ever know. Every prayer you said for me, every time you held my hand, every moment you spent with me, it was like medicine for my soul. Children don't realize how powerful their love is. But a child's love is the closest thing to divine love that exists on earth." She led me to sit beside her on the bench. "The second thing I want you to know is that my death served a purpose in your life that I could see even then, but you couldn't understand until now. When I died, you began asking the deepest questions about existence, about meaning, about what happens after death. Those questions shaped your spiritual journey in ways that led you directly to the role you're playing now. I thought about how my fear of death had driven me to seek God more desperately than I might have otherwise." "So, you're saying your death was part of God's plan for my life, not just your life, darling. Your seeking, your questions, your deep desire to understand death and what comes after, it's prepared you to help millions of other people who have the same fears and questions you had. When you portray Jesus talking about eternal life, you're not just reciting lines. You're speaking from a heart that has genuinely wrestled with these mysteries." She smiled, and her smile contained all the love I remembered from childhood, plus something new. The wisdom that comes from seeing reality from God's perspective. The third thing I want you to know is that I never really left you. I've been present for every important moment of your life since I died. Your high school graduation, your first acting job, the day you were cast as Jesus. Every time you've needed guidance or comfort, I've been there sending you love and support. But I couldn't feel you, I said, because you were looking for me in the wrong way. You were expecting to sense me as I was when I had a physical body. But I exist now in a much more subtle way. Every time you felt sudden peace in the middle of anxiety, every time an unexpected opportunity has opened up, every time you felt mysteriously strengthened during difficult moments, much of that has been my love reaching you. Jesus sat down with us, and his presence intensified the love that was already surrounding us. This is what most people don't understand about death. He said love doesn't end when the body ends. Love becomes purified, concentrated, more powerful. The dead don't love less than they did when they were alive. They love more because they're no longer limited by fear, doubt, or physical constraints. My grandmother nodded. And that brings me to the fourth thing I want you to know, Jonathan. Death isn't something to fear. It's something to prepare for joyfully. Not because life isn't precious, but because death is the doorway to an existence so much more beautiful than anything you can imagine. She gestured around the garden, but I sensed she was indicating something far beyond what I could see. This place where we are now is just the beginning. There are realms of existence, ways of serving and growing and loving adventures of consciousness that will take eternity to explore. Death isn't the end of the journey. It's graduation to infinite possibility. But what about people who don't believe? I asked. What about people who have no faith? Jesus answered this one. Belief doesn't determine what happens after death. Jonathan, love does. Some of the most loving people I've ever known have struggled with traditional religious belief. And some of the most religiously correct people have struggled with actually loving others. When someone dies, what matters isn't what they believed about me intellectually, but how they lived my teaching about love practically. My grandmother squeezed my hand. The fifth thing I want you to know is that every person you love who is still alive on earth will be okay. Death is natural, Jonathan. It's as natural as birth, as natural as growing up and leaving home. When people understand this, they stop clinging so desperately to life and start living more fully. She stood up and walked to the edge of a stream that flowed through the garden, its water looking like liquid light. And that brings me to the most important thing I want you to understand. The reason Jesus brought you here, the reason he's letting you have this experience, isn't just to comfort you about death. It's to change how you live. Jesus joined us by the stream. When people truly understand what death is, a transition to greater love, greater consciousness, greater service, it transforms how they approach every day they have in their physical body. They stop wasting time on things that don't matter. They prioritize relationships over achievements. They choose love over fear in every situation. That's your message, my grandmother said, turning back to me. Not just that death isn't scary, but that understanding death correctly makes life more beautiful. When people know that consciousness continues, that love is eternal, that every day is preparing them for infinite possibility, they live with purpose, with joy, with hope that nothing can shake. I felt the truth of what she was saying resonating in every cell of my body. My lifelong fear of death hadn't just been about dying, it had been limiting how fully I could live. How do I share this? I asked. How do I tell people what I've seen without sounding crazy? Jesus smiled. The same way you've been sharing everything else, by living it, when you go back to Earth, when you finish filming The Chosen, when you interact with fans and critics and loved ones, you carry this understanding with you. People will sense something different about you. They'll see a piece about mortality that they want for themselves. My grandmother took both my hands one final time, and when you feel sad, missing me, remember this moment. Remember that I'm not gone. I'm just in a different classroom learning different lessons, preparing for greater service. One day, when your Earth assignment is complete, you'll graduate to this realm too, and we'll have all of eternity to be together. The garden began to fade around us, and I knew my time in this place was ending. But before we left, Jesus said one more thing. The greatest gift you can give people isn't certainty about what happens after death. It's confidence that love is eternal. Thanks for God.